Hi, I'm Steve Plaich, and I'll be your host for this edition of Voices from the Village. Tonight, we'll be talking about Cuba, a New Deal. With me tonight, I'm very pleased to have people who know a heck of a lot more about this than I do, so I'm really looking forward to learning myself. John Waller, former coordinator for the Pastors for Peace Caravan to Cuba. John, welcome. Thank you. And Nancy Abbey, of course, welcome back. A guest many times, People's Democratic Club, Santa Cruz, Cuba Caravans, and USA Cuba Sister Cities. As we get started, John, why don't you let our audience know you a little bit, what your background is and how you really became engaged in the issue of Cuba and Cuba relations.
Okay. As I start talking, you can tell I'm not from around here. I'm English. And
that's the King's English right there.
Yep. I used to work as a manager in the British National Health Service. And that got me first interested in Cuba because of the impressive achievements of Cuba's healthcare system, which was similar-ish to Britain's, but they were achieving the same or better with much less resources. So I first went to Cuba leading a delegation of health workers to study Cuba's health system. And I was there at the time when Cuba's trade deal with the Soviet Union had ended. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and the economy was in free fall, and the US was trying to move in for the kill. And I could see what suffering was occurring because of the US blockade. And that motivated me to become involved in solidarity with Cuba. And for 10 years I was involved in England as part of one of the leaders of the Cuba Solidarity campaign there. And through that I became aware of an organization called Pastors for Peace, based in New York. Organization in the tradition of the US civil rights movement that was taking humanitarian aid to Cuba, but was doing it without US government permission, because the US government didn't approve of that. And so they were saying, when we see a policy that we approve of and believe is against God's will, our role is to break it, is to just take aid to Cuba. So for 8 years I was the coordinator of that.
Okay, wonderful.
I stopped being the coordinator in 2011 and have gone back to, in the US, working as a health center manager. But through the caravan, I also met my wife, who was living in Santa Cruz.
That's a
great that's why I'm living in Santa Cruz.
Well, good for you. Well, welcome to Santa Cruz. We're delighted to have you. And Nancy, many times a guest here with me and others on different shows. You're the president of the People's Democratic Club, doing great work there.
Thank you.
And just let people know a bit about your background and your initial engagement with the issue.
I was raised as a socialist, and in a family where we still felt that there was a lot of promise in communism. So when the revolution happened and Fidel Castro came to the United States, I was really excited. I thought, this is fabulous, this is wonderful. And then Eisenhower wouldn't meet with him. And it made me so angry that there was nothing I could really do at that point. There was I lived way out in the sticks. I'm from Appalachia. There was really nothing I could do about it, but it always stayed with me. And so I didn't really get engaged actively in any organization or any effort around Cuba until I moved down here to Santa Cruz and retired from teaching. And I learned about an organization that we were starting here in town, Takashi Yogi, which a lot of activists in town know. Takashi Yogi and a couple other people, Ellen Farmer, started an organization just to study Cuba. We called ourselves the Cuba Study Group, which turned out to be a very bad name because there's a right-wing Cuba Study Group in New Jersey that's very much anti-Castro. But anyway, we were the Cuba Study Group.
Interesting. Right.
And we did a lot of work studying ourselves, but putting on films and events for the community. And then we learned about the US-Cuba Sister Cities. And I'll talk a little bit about that later.
Please.
And I became involved in that. I was the national treasurer for a while. And then when Bush came into office and we were no longer allowed to travel as sister cities to Cuba, I withdrew from that, and at that time learned about the Pastors for Peace. And so with the help of some other people, we formed a contingent of the Pastors for Peace caravan here in Santa Cruz.
That's a rich history of engaging with that. So as we start the subject here, and the topic is Cuba, a New Deal, question mark. Let me read something from our president. In December, President Obama announced the United States is taking steps to restore full diplomacy with Cuba, a historic move that will end 50 years of frozen relations with the communist nation. He said, "I believe we can do more to support the Cuban people and our values through engagement." Mr. Obama said, "These 50 years have shown that isolation has not worked. It's time for a new approach." So, John, after 50 years of blockade, why has the administration changed its policy about Cuba?
Okay, before answering that, let's look back a bit at history. Nancy was saying how she welcomed Fidel Castro coming to the United States, and President Eisenhower didn't. And first, for 2 years under Eisenhower and then Kennedy, the aim was to overthrow the Cuban Revolution by force, by assassination attempts on Fidel Castro and other leaders.
Of course.
And then the invasion, supporting Cuban American exiles, the Bay of Pigs, which was defeated. But in '61, they concluded from their own surveys that Fidel Castro was actually very popular in Cuba, the policies he was pursuing, and that they had to change. So what they did was to institute the economic blockade, which was basically an attempt to bring the Cuban economy down, to cut off all trade with the US and as much trade as possible with the rest of the world, and starve the Cuban people, and to get them to rise up in opposition to the government. That was the fundamental policy. But also there was a second, lesser track, which was to create contact in a controlled way to build up opponents of Castro, opponents of the revolution, dissidents, and so through that contact, generate that counter-revolution. And they also were determined to try and isolate Cuba from its natural constituency and trading partners, not just in the US, but in the rest of Latin America. So what Obama was recognizing that the blockade policy, although it has done an enormous amount of damage to Cuba over 50 years, hadn't achieved its objective. The Cuban people hadn't risen up, and that he concluded, I think rightly, that they weren't going to rise up, and so there was a need for a change. But he was also responding to pressure from the rest of Latin America, because for 30 years Cuba had remained isolated in Latin America. But then in the last 20 years, that's all changed. Cuba has now very good diplomatic relations with the rest of the Americas. And Secretary of State John Kerry admitted at the same time as Obama made that speech, he said, it's not Cuba that's isolated by our policy, it's we who are isolated by our policy.
It's an interesting perspective.
Yeah. So what Obama is now saying is that the blockade hasn't worked. He's taking some steps that he can take, maybe not all yet he could, but certainly some, to ease it. He said that rightly that the full elimination of it has to be done by Congress, because some of it is enshrined in law. But also he's talking about the other track, which is that we want to encourage more contact with Cuba. But what we think and what Cubans think is that part of that approach is still to encourage the kind of contact which will create dissent and promote dissent.
Right.
Well, I don't think it's even that subtle. I think he has actually said that the intent or the expectation is that by more contact, the people will then see that there is a better way in capitalism, which is very ironic given that our capitalistic system isn't working very well right now. But there is also, we often say that the blockade didn't work. And yet a friend of mine, while she was living in Cuba, emailed me one time and said, you know, this blockade works. Every day of my life, every day when I get up, something impacts me from the blockade. And it discourages people. It not only hampered the government from doing some of the programs that they would like to do and to do them well, but it discouraged people because life was hard. And of course, I mean, there's another thing. And Charlie said, make sure you get across the reality of Cuba, that it isn't what people in the US know or think it is. We go down there, most people just go to Havana, see young people without cell phones, without cameras, with all these things, and think, these poor people. And truly, the Cubans complain a lot.
Right.
I mean, they really, they all complain about everything. But if you have traveled through Central America or through Mexico or any of the other islands, you see poverty. You know what poverty is, and you don't see that kind of poverty in Cuba. You see people who are well-dressed, who have health care, who have housing, but they don't have a lot of other money to spend. They don't have a lot of money to spend on other things. But they're so much better off than a great, vast number of Mexicans or people in Central America, or any of the other islands for that matter.
So before we move on, I want to remind our listeners or our viewers that this is a live call-in show. You can reach us at 425-8848, 425-8848, extension 30, and ask either of our panelists a question. One of the things I think that people are aware of, even if they have even just passing understanding of the Cuban blockade or our lack of relationship with them, is the travel restrictions. And there have been long-standing travel restrictions, very, very well known. You know, what has changed in the area of travel restrictions now?
Okay, just again to start with a bit of history. Yes, for many years, Cuba has been unique in the world in that it's the only country which the US citizens were not allowed to travel to by policy of their own government, the US government. There's been a bit of a difference between Republican and Democrat administrations. Republicans tended to go for a complete ban. Democrat administrations tended to go for a limited control, so that there was this system of licensing established, particularly under the Clinton administration and again under Obama, which would mean that certain people could go if they met certain criteria. So you'd have to apply for a license, and the State Department would decide whether you were approved or not. This could be for going for an educational trip, it could be going for religious purposes, it could be going as a professional journalist.
For instance, Pastors of Peace, that kind of thing?
It's separate.
Oh, it's separate, okay.
Pastors of Peace, we took a position that licensing was wrong in principle.
Oh, okay.
And also what one government could grant, the other next could take it away. So everything that Clinton granted, Bush took away. So we said there should be no restrictions on US citizens going to Cuba, and no restrictions on US citizens sending humanitarian aid to Cuba. That's why we said we are going openly and publicly without a license. We were breaking a civil law, unlicensed travel to Cuba.
Well, good for you.
And we've done that 26 times now since 1992.
Wow.
So what's changing? Obama, in his first year of his presidency, brought back the licenses and brought in more or less unrestricted travel for Cuban Americans to Cuba. That was a good step, but then he stopped. Now he's extended it even more widely, so that licensing remains. You no longer still don't have a right to go to Cuba, but the system of control of the licenses has been drastically reduced. So basically, they published the criteria by which would mean you could be covered under a license. So you don't have to apply for one anymore. You just say, well, I'm going for educational purposes. This covers me. I can go to Cuba. Obviously, to go to Cuba, you've got to book a flight, and probably in the next months, the possibilities for flying direct from the US to Cuba will open up. That's in the new provisions. The airlines have to make it happen.
Right.
And they've got to see that it's going to be profitable. But probably that's going to open up. But those airlines will still have to, you will have to sign something saying that I'm covered by this specification of the licensing policy. And the airlines for 5 years will have to keep your names, addresses, phone numbers, etc. Probably nothing will happen.
Right.
There's still a chance that in 2 years we may have a Republican president who's opposed to the licenses, and there will be follow-up. I'm not saying that will happen. I think it's unlikely. And so this is an opportunity now for US people to go to Cuba in a far less restricted way.
There is, though, the caveat that you still can't go as a tourist. And if you go for educational purposes, you're supposed to spend all your time for those educational purposes. I don't know whether they still, you used to, at one point, I understand, because I haven't traveled on a license very much. I'm very proud to say I haven't.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't believe in the licenses, and I didn't travel with a license. But you had to have a plan for how you were going to spend your time, and it had to be for the purpose you said. It couldn't just be free time to be a tourist.
I'm curious, even under these very stringent regulations for travel in the past, how have travelers from the United States been received by the people in Cuba?
Very warmly.
Yeah, yeah.
They're able to separate us from our government.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they say that all the time. They know that the restrictions, that the blockade is caused by the government, and they don't see us as the government.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Cuban people, Cuba is 90 miles from the United States. Cuban people have a lot of cultural connections with the United States. So there's never been any animosity towards US citizens by the Cuban people or by the Cuban government. The animosity has been towards the US government.
And I do want to ask at some point about the impact that the normalization would have on the Cuban American population that is in Florida. But let's move on to what has or hasn't changed in the area of trade. We talked about travel. What about trade?
Well, trade's a whole other ball of wax. And there's, at this point, there are a couple things that have been opened up. For instance, now you're allowed to bring back $100 worth of cigars and $100 worth of Cuban rum, or maybe it's 200
combined. 100 combined.
Or 100 combined? I thought it was 100 of each. I mean, it's all still, we're all trying to figure out what it really is about. And you can import for sale in the United States up to $800 worth of goods if they are goods from artisans or independent producers of the material. We still can't import the things that the Cuban government itself manufactures, or the zinc, sugar, those sorts of things that are the major products of Cuba. That's one of the things that we're hoping may be changed at some point. If we're trying to find out right now whether or not if Cuba is taken off the state sponsors of terrorism list, if this will then negate some of the rules that have been in place about trade. For instance, a third country can't sell to Cuba a product that has 10% or more of its components made in the United States. Okay. This has been part of the blockade. We think that possibly that's part of Trading with the Enemy Act, or aspect of the
NDAA?
And that may be something that can be eliminated.
Yeah.
And maybe even the idea of us being able to import for testing some of the medicines. It would still have to go through our drug testing in the United States. And there have been a couple that have been brought into the United States and tested. But it may make it much easier for us to receive some of the medicines that...
Can I just bring in a little example?
Go ahead.
About when you say 10%, what does that mean in real life? Heart pacemakers. Cuba has long not been able to buy heart pacemakers from the United States, but for a long time they could buy them from companies in Sweden and Germany. Right. But then the US discovered that there were components in those pacemakers that were made in the US. Right. And so Cuba, at some point in the 90s, could no longer buy those pacemakers from independent Swedish and German companies. That's obviously a major impact on an individual's life.
Well, let me ask you just a general question, John or Nancy. To what extent will the relaxation of these trade sanctions actually strengthen the Cuban economy internally?
Well, see, that's the question, because it'll put money in the hands of individual producers of crafts or of materials. And from my point of view, it just breaks my heart, because then that just tears away at the socialist underpinnings of the Cuban economy.
Mm-hmm.
And
Sure.
I think that's the intent now. You know, we didn't succeed in getting people to rise up and overthrow the government there, but if we can get more and more money in the hands of the individuals and increase the capitalist sort of
So
aspect
exploitation
of
of
Cuba,
capitalism, basically.
yeah, then that will undermine the socialist.
So there, in a way, for the more suspicious amongst us, is, you know, there is a hidden agenda here.
Sure.
Yeah.
I don't even think it's hidden.
Yeah.
I think it's really.
I mean, I'm
truly,
talking
this
about
is
the
another
people,
way
you know,
of
who are
doing it.
watching the show who don't have the depth of understanding that you or John may about this, and are wanting to know more about this, or wanting to know what the programs are, what they are as a practical matter, but also what they will look like in terms of policy shifts and in terms
Right.
of geopolitical situations
Right.
and things like that. So it's interesting.
So what we're saying is not that the Cuban independent artisans shouldn't be able to sell their goods to the United States. They should be, but so should everybody in Cuba.
Right.
The Cuban state who produces the nickel, produces the medicines, or produces the sugar should be able to sell to the United States, so that everybody in Cuba is benefiting, not just a small sector.
And the socialist programs can be supported, the health care. One of the things that's been bothering me tremendously is reading over and over again about the lack of human rights in Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
And you, being someone involved with the American Civil Liberties Union, knows we're not talking about human rights. We're talking about civil rights.
Mm-hmm.
Human rights, I think we need to be very clear. There's a difference between human rights and civil rights.
Surely, yeah.
The Cuban people have human rights. They have the right to education all the way through college, you know, as far as they can go. They have
Free.
the right to health care. They have the right to housing. They have the right to food. We don't have those rights in the United States. What has been infringed upon is the civil rights, the rights for free speech. I mean, it's curtailed to some extent, especially for writers who want to write in opposition to the government.
The assembly has been somewhat...
Assembly, and what am I missing there? Oh, voting. You know, they don't have a two-party system there.
Yeah.
I mean, our
Maybe they should count themselves fortunate in that respect, considering what
But there
the
is
two-party system
a very
has
well developed
yielded in
electoral
this country.
system in Cuba.
Yeah.
It's not a two-party system.
Yeah.
It's a no-party system
right.
where people are elected on the basis of their individual abilities.
The elections start out with somebody writing their qualifications and why they want to have this office in the small municipality, or they break them down into small precincts. And it's an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper that they post in a central location. And that's where they start. There's no money involved. And there's the party's there. I mean, we can't deny that. The party's really strong. In the communities, the party's strong. But dissidents just don't get elected in their cities because they don't have the trust of the people. And because people, over and over again, every study that's been done, or every, you know, people going there and talking and trying to find out, surveys, that people really appreciate their health care and their education. They don't want to lose those things. So I'm not quite sure where I was going with that, but
you know, what's fascinating to me is that, and what occurs to me from my limited knowledge of Cuba, is that this 50-plus year blockade has really drawn a veil over Cuba. Is that people in the United States, they don't have a window onto what their life is like, you know, what their civil liberties are, what their civil rights are, what their human rights are, what their level of education is, you know, whether or not they are, you know, able to sustain themselves economically, or just how they are as people. And I think that's unfortunate. And if this, you know, normalization of relations does anything, you know, more than, you know, maybe push that veil aside and let people who live in the United States here, who are interested in Cuba, be able to have a window on that world and be able to get closer to that culture and those people, I think then it's valuable. Then it's accomplished some purpose, you know, other than the economic or the socio-political or the geopolitical or anything else that may be happening. So I did want to ask both of you, and the question will, of course, be about the work of Cuban solidarity that's being done in Santa Cruz and really all over the country. What effect is the normalization going to have on the Cuban-American community in Florida?
Okay. The Cuban-American community has been changing over in the last 20 years. The people who came in 1959, 60, 61 were first of all the elite of Cuba, and then middle classes who felt that the revolution wasn't going to be in their interests. And many of them came bitterly opposed. They dreamed that they would be going back in 6 months' time, because that's how long it would last. And so what's become known as the Cuban-American Mafia, the Cuban-American Lobby in Florida and in New Jersey, as the principal centers, has had a vitriolic hatred of the Cuban government. And they've become enormously wealthy, some of them, in the United States.
Well, they brought their wealth with them.
Yes, they brought their wealth. But since then, in the last 20 years, the Cubans who've come in the last 20 years have been coming for the same reasons that El Salvadorians come or Mexicans come. Coming to the richest country in the world for a better economic standard of life. And whatever their view of their homeland or their government, they don't hate it. They want normal relations. They want to be able to travel just freely to see their family. If they've prospered economically in the United States, they want to send money back to their family. So they've increasingly become a lobby, not very well organized, but a voting bloc in Florida saying, we want normal relations. So now, I think the latest poll showed that something like 60% of Cuban Americans wanted normal relations. In pure electoral terms in Florida, this is a smart move by Obama.
And my impression is, and it's not a knowledgeable one, that it's a generational shift. I think that people who came from Cuba to the United States a generation ago dreamt of going home again and tried to maintain that dream. It says, we're working to be able to go back to our home, and as time has gone on, as the generations have come and gone, that's changed.
There are a couple of things I want to point out. One is that there was a tremendous influx of Cubans into the United States long before the revolution. It was, and mostly to New Jersey, actually.
Oh, that's interesting. John had mentioned that, and I wasn't aware of that.
But the other thing is, I think, again, when we're being careful about terms that we use, this is going to be a process. Right now, we're establishing, or hope to establish, diplomatic relations, right? The normalization comes after the diplomatic relations. There was a comment in a meeting the other night by somebody who said, well, this may not go anywhere, or is sort of the message they were giving, this may not go anywhere because Castro's saying, he's saying that we have to return Guantanamo. Well, what Castro actually said, I don't know whether you read this, but in a meeting was that, in fact, I think I have a copy of it here. The reestablishment of diplomatic relations is the start of a process of normalizing bilateral relations. But this will not be possible while the blockade still exists, while they don't give back the territory illegally occupied by the Guantanamo naval base. So it's just a matter of it's going to be a lot of, it's going to take time to get to normal relations.
And as an aside, just for my personal interest, is Fidel still driving policy in is it Raul's driving policy?
Fidel ceased to be the president in 1996, 2006, for health reasons. Raul, his younger brother, became the president. So
who was vice president, so he became president.
And for those who don't know, Raul Castro is?
He's Fidel Castro's younger brother. They were both historic leaders of the revolution.
Right.
He was constitutionally the vice president. He, under new rules that he himself brought in, that limits any president to 2 terms, he will cease to be the president in 2018 at the next election, and a new president will be elected. But Fidel, I'm sure his advice is sought as an incredibly wise elder statesman, but he has no direct involvement in the government, and hasn't had for about 10 years now.
That's interesting. So let's turn, really curious, you mentioned this earlier when we were having a conversation. There's always been a lot of Cuban solidarity work done in Santa Cruz. So what's going on now? And how is that going to be shifting at all in terms of the diplomatic relations changing, and ultimately, if there is normalization that takes place, how will it be affected?
Do you want to talk about the caravan?
Maybe you do the Santa Cruz first, and I broaden it to the caravan. Yeah.
Okay. It's a little bit hard for me to even talk about doing anything around Cuba without talking about the caravan.
Or shall I start then?
Yeah, why don't you? Because I think
John, why don't you start?
Yeah,
yes.
Okay. So I will do local and national.
Please.
But the caravan has continued for nearly 25 years. Mm-hmm. It's going to happen again this year, because we want to establish that it's it's much freer now under the new licensing arrangements. But as I said, a future president could take that away, as George Bush did. Maybe the next president will be Jeb Bush. We hope not.
Wow.
But we want to establish that there is unrestricted travel to Cuba.
Of course.
There's a bill just being introduced by a Republican senator from Arizona, Jeff Flake, into the Senate, which would, if passed, bring unrestricted travel. So we're going to carry on going to Cuba in the caravan, saying your citizens should have a right to go to Cuba. And we'll also be taking some humanitarian aid. We'll be showing the people who come with us the reality of Cuba.
Absolutely, yeah.
Although many of the people who go aren't religious, the organization's leadership is religious. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we say is we take people, one of the myths about Cuba is that there's restrictions on religious freedom. And we say to the caravanistas, whether you're an atheist or a Christian or a Jew, come with us to Christian services in Cuba, witness people expressing their faith freely. So there will be another caravan this July. Santa Cruz has a proud history of supporting that caravan, both sometimes sending buses on it, but often sending people, sometimes people who can afford to go themselves, but often we've raised money to enable young people in our community, particularly Sandino Gomez, who is often a presenter on this channel, has benefited from that program where we raise money to enable him to go to Cuba. We're seeking through events to raise money to send another young person from Santa Cruz on this caravan. But we're also encouraging as many people as possible who can afford to pay to go themselves as part of the caravan.
And before, I'm sure Nancy has some observations about that, we do have a short clip that I think Sandino had actually sent to Ken Nober, who is running the board for us this evening. If we could see that clip, maybe that would be a good time to run that.
In 1988, while doing a fact-finding trip about the need for humanitarian aid in Central America and the Caribbean, I was on a ferry boat which was attacked by Contra. And I was wounded and realized that my taxes paid for the bullet which shot me. I was outraged. I was morally indignant. The response was to create an alternative to U.S. policy in the region, to give humanitarian aid, to build solidarity, friendship, relationships with people, rather than buy into the mean-spirited, hostile policy of our own government, which destroys life.
We were asked by Cuban religious leaders to begin organizing caravans to Cuba right at the time that Cuba's economy was disappearing, and we knew that the Cuban people were going to be suffering mightily and be very much more affected by the U.S. blockade, while most of the people in the United States really had no idea that Cuba even was being blockaded by the United States.
This caravan is an act of solidarity, not charity. Yes, we bring the Cuban people desperately needed items, but we don't do it because they can't do it for themselves. If it wasn't for this embargo, the Cuban people would be just fine to trade and have normal business relations with us. But it's our government that insists on punishing Cuba for daring to have a different model.
With all this aid we take, ranging from aspirins to walkers to Bibles to computers, all items that our government refuses to trade with Cuba, we take it as a collective challenge against this immoral policy.
On the caravan, you stop every now and then in the city, and there's an event, so you talk to people, you invite the local people who want to know more about Cuba.
We just came from visiting 140 cities all around the United States, and in each one of those cities we had an educational event, a potluck dinner, many press conferences and media opportunities to talk to the public of the United States, to let people know what the reality of the blockade is and how mean-spirited it is and how counterproductive it is and how just plain wrong.
And I think something like Pastors for Peace offers people, it brings to people's door the opportunity to do things that they otherwise might not do on their own. And it's encouraging for everyone. They love it, we love it, and it's just this great symbiotic relationship that carries the whole thing across the sea to Cuba.
And we ask everyone as we travel to reach out, to call President Obama, to call the White House, to call members of Congress, to say we want the travel restrictions to end, we want the bills in Congress to pass to end the restrictions on travel. We want the whole blockade lifted. We want the Cuban Five to be freed.
That the time is now to end this foolish, stupid, senseless blockade. So we're looking and trying to find ways to get Obama's attention, because we're not sure that he gets it yet. His staff people around him are still the holdovers from the Bush administration. There aren't new people with new ideas yet in the administration. And we're trying to find a way to send a message to him that the American people do not want the blockade. We want it ended.
Cuba, see, bloqueo, no. Pastors for Peace gon' break the embargo. Cuba, see, bloqueo, no. We got to be free, that's just the way that
Exciting this is.
And of course, a wonderful clip, and in that clip you saw our good friend and host here, Sandino Gomez. Sandino, a bit under the weather this evening, so Sandino, get well. Return to us soon. John, you had some comments?
A few comments about that video. The person who was speaking at the beginning, at the end, was the Reverend Lucius Walker, who was the founder of Pastors for Peace and directed it for 20 years before his death in 2010. A contemporary of Martin Luther King, a co-thinker of Martin Luther King. But you also saw people of many ages. I mean, we've had parents who come with their children. We've had people of 85 go on the caravan. People of all races. There was one very thick German accent there. It's an international caravan as well.
Wonderful.
And then there was also mention about the caravan is not just about going to Cuba. The caravan is many routes through the United States and events all the way along those routes where we're trying to educate people about the Cuban reality and about the blockade. And we're encouraging people to reach out to President Obama. And in the coming caravan, we're going to be particularly encouraging people to reach out to their members of Congress, their senators, because we'll see in the next few months how far President Obama is prepared to go to change policy. He's made some starts. But fully lifting the blockade and lifting the travel ban has to be done by Congress because it's enshrined in some laws. And there's measures starting to be introduced about both on trade and travel. So we're going to be encouraging people, not just the caravanistas, but the people who come to our events, to reach out to their representatives, to lobby them for a full change, to not move to a new way of overthrowing Cuba, but to say, let's end the policy of blockade and have free trade and free travel.
And of course, one of the things that we want to do here with Voice from the Village is to make sure that people have an opportunity to participate. You know, that they know you have the contact information. It's really a call to action when we're talking about a lot of these things. So make sure as we go along that the people have the information that they can contact you directly or be involved in the caravan so they'll know. I think that's very important, and we certainly want to get that information out.
I think that I would like to tell a couple stories because
Please, yeah.
for people to understand that this is a really exciting, fun, educational, inspiring thing to do. We travel, as John said, through different routes through the United States, come together on the border at McAllen, Texas. And you'll see all these trucks and cars, and I don't know what's going to be in it this year, but buses carrying material aid and caravanistas, we call it everybody, caravanistas. And on the border there, we have to take all the stuff out of the buses and reshuffle it and catalog it so that we can take it through customs. And there's a great spirit of camaraderie. I mean, it's really fun. As John said, all ages and people from other countries. We get a lot of Canadians on the trips coming down through California. And although it's really miserable and grueling driving across the desert in the middle of the summer, you're doing it for a reason that is so inspiring that it's bearable. One time I remember being, I don't know whether we were already in Cuba or whether it was on the way, but we were in a circle on the morning just doing a sort of coming together. And Lucius said something I'll never forget, and that was, we are doing this not just in defiance of our government, but in obedience to our conscience. And that touched me so much, because that's really what people are doing. We're going across that border because we think the blockade's wrong, because we feel that we have brothers and sisters in Cuba and that we should be able to be good neighbors to Cuba. And when we traveled then in a caravan down from McAllen down to Tampico. And the material aid then gets put onto barges, and the Mexican longshoremen help load that stuff onto. There's a strong solidarity group.
They donate their labor free.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. And it goes across in barges, and we fly over, and we get to see things that tourists don't get to see. We get to see. We get to be tourists too, but we get to see things that the government is doing. Like we went to, one of the last times I was there, I think, we went to the eye hospital. And the surgeon, the head of the hospital, came out and talked to us about the program they have, because they do eye surgery for people all over the country and Central America and Mexico. So all of a sudden, this screen opened up in front of us, and we saw people moving around, and we saw this scene of, about 7 different beds lined up. And at first, I thought it was a tape from, taken a while back, but it turned out that we were looking into the operating room while they were operating, doing these eye surgeries. I had had 3 of the 4 that they showed.
Really?
So I was like,
there you go.
I was really very interested in it. But you get to see things like that. You get to go to senior centers where, I mean, they've done so many things. Schools, the Latin American School of Medicine, where we have something like 90 people there now.
US
young people on scholarships from all over the world. I just want to tell people, it is an amazing trip. Well, you will get things you don't get going as a tourist.
And the hope is, at least from my point of view, that relaxation of any kind of travel restrictions will give people an opportunity to see Cuba, through the eyes that you're able to see, from John's able to see, the beauty of Cuba, the people, the open warmth of the people of Cuba, rather than the things that normally you see as urban core congestion or abject poverty or things like that. There is so much more to see. And if the relaxation of these travel restrictions, again, have any tangible effect and result or yield some good, maybe that's one of the things that allow more people to go there and actually see Cuba, see the Cuban people, understand it better. And isn't that what really this is all about, is understanding your neighbors better?
And hopefully for them to understand us better.
Well, absolutely. It's a reciprocal process.
I want to give another anecdote. There was, on that clip, there was a little bit of hip-hop at the end. On that year, we took a number of US hip-hop artists on the caravan. They were making contact with Cuban hip-hop artists, direct people-to-people contact. We've discovered since that, I've read since that at roughly the same time, one of the programs of the US government was to try and make contact with Cuban hip-hop artists and offer them contracts and try and use them to promote dissent. It was a program that failed because the hip-hop artists, although they have their criticisms of their country and their government, and they express them through their medium, they also remain loyal to their country.
Of course,
and it's a social project.
I think one of the things that people know about Cuba is that they send doctors all over the world into third world countries. And it's a tremendous effort of diplomacy that I wish we did also. But the USAID, through the State Department, actually has a program that contacts these doctors when they're in other countries and invites them to leave Cuba and to come to the United States. They actively recruit people from this program, which seems like such a heartless thing to do. But I think the statistic is something like only 10% of the doctors are, I don't know.
I think it's less, like 5%. Yeah.
Pardon me?
I think it's more like 5%.
5%? 5% have actually done that because they know that they're doing something so worthwhile.
And one of the titles under your name this evening is about U.S.-Cuba sister cities. Now, tell us something about that.
That's really very interesting. Santa Cruz County, some years ago, I'm very bad on dates, 2006, I think it was, established a sister county relationship with the municipality of Woma, which is if you know Cuba at all, it's like a vacuum cleaner sort of.
It's right there next to you. You can't really see it, but
well, no, you wouldn't be able to. But it's in the southeast part of Cuba, near Guantanamo, in Santiago province. And this was established not through Sister Cities International because Sister Cities International was not allowed to have sister cities in Cuba. Or the U.S. government would not allow that. And in fact, Cuba did not want to have international sister cities associations because of their association with the U.S. State Department. They couldn't really trust for the state, a State Department.
Of course,
to come in. So right now, it's a very interesting thing. In the past year, Sister Cities International has actually started listing the cities that we established on their website. And we don't know, the president of U.S.-Cuba Sister Cities was in Cuba in the first week of the month, this month. And had
so very recently,
had conversations with the people that we were associated with in Cuba before, the foreign ministry. And at this point, they're reviewing the whole thing. They're still not sure that they want to, they have to wait to see what happens with the diplomatic relations before they decide whether or not they will actually deal with Sister Cities International or whether they still want U.S.-Cuba Sister Cities to be the go-between.
Yeah, it's always been my view, at least in international relations, that the best way to foster greater understanding is from the grassroots level up. It's not necessarily from the State Department, talking to, the bureaucracy in Cuba. It's people of the United States, people like yourself, people like John, who are traveling to Cuba, talking to the Cuban people. They're talking to you. You're exchanging ideas. You're exchanging, the cultural, wonderful parts of the things that you really share as human beings. And I think that really is something that may come of this normalization. When it happens, John, you mentioned that it's diplomatic relations now. Normalization will come, perhaps. But.
And actually, the Sister City Committee in Santa Cruz has a resolution to establish a friendship city, which is the way you explore through Sister Cities International, a sister city relationship. And they've chosen Cheverico, which is a city in the municipality that the county is already associated with. So we're waiting to see what's going to happen with that.
And John, your observations about that?
I think all forms of contact are valuable. And the sister cities is one of the routes that people can take. So I'm wholeheartedly in support of what Nancy's trying to do. Again, I want to come back to this. I made the comment earlier, it's got some negative reaction about maybe the next president will be Jeb Bush. And maybe it'll be another
Well, just negative reaction now on this table. I'm sure that he has some popular support somewhere, but just not in this room.
And Sister Cities was developing, the concept started developing under the Clinton administration when Democrats were allowing some contact with Cuba. Right. And then it went into reverse under Bush. And I feel that we've got a 2-year window where we know we have Obama, we don't know who the following president will be, where we need to be pushing hard by every means possible, through caravans, through sister cities, through Congress, to get the laws removed, so that whoever the next president is, they can't reverse policy. It's now accepted that we will have normal relations with Cuba.
And of course, President Obama, in the last 2 years of his administration, is looking to a lasting legacy. You know, what is he going? What are his signature achievements going to be in office? You know, healthcare or diplomatic relations of one kind or another. But you know, this is an opportunity for him. You know, to say, you know, now is the time to make this move. You know, now is the time that I can make this move and get some popular and congressional, perhaps, support for it. So it is subtextually the president's looking to a lasting legacy, and if it comes at a time when Cuban relations are going to improve, then I think it's a wonderful opportunity. But we will have to see.
Yeah. But I want to re-emphasize that he's implementing measures that, on balance, are positive, but still with the mentality of how can we change Cuba?
Right.
And what we want to see is just accept that the US has its system, people like us want to change that system, but it has its system, Cuba has its system. Countries can have different social systems, but can still have normal, not just diplomatic relations, but normal relations of travel and trade, and can be respectful about each other's different ways of doing things.
Well, and Nancy mentioned that earlier, that subtextually we are, you know, in some ways exporting capitalism because we want to make Cuba better, but the way to make it better is to export our capitalism to them, and they're going to embrace this and say, well, this is going to rise us out of poverty, and that's really the way that we want to be viewed by the world, and I don't think that should be our national policies, but it is what we have now. So I think people like Nancy and yourself are going to make the best of it as we go forward, and a lot of people of goodwill you know, are going to really take this as an opportunity to strengthen the bonds of the Cuban people, and maybe capitalism won't be our most notable export. Maybe the warmth and open-handedness and generosity of the American people will be what the Cuban people see, and we're certainly hoping so.
Yeah. Throughout the last 50 years, particularly in the last 10, 15 years, US scientists and Cuban scientists have been doing their best to cooperate. There's been cooperation between the respective agencies to stop drug smuggling. There's been cooperation over hurricane forecasting. People of goodwill in their professions, working together, learning from each other. That's what we want to see.
A lot has been happening that we aren't told about, that we don't read about in the media. It's all sort of sub rosa. But there has been a lot of contact and a lot of collaboration.
Well, you know, clearly, I've gathered from our hour we spent here, you and John are very excited about this, you know, but you have been doing this work for a while. And this is perhaps an opportunity to have other people take advantage of your experience and the groundwork that you've laid, and to become part of this kind of movement toward, you know, really normalizing relations between the United States and Cuba. And I think it's a tribute to the work that you and John have both done, is the point that I'm making. And we thank you for that, because you have worked, I think, under adverse conditions where the travel was difficult, and even though you're standing up and saying, oh, we don't need to be licensed, we're going to go, you know, because that's something that you do as individual activists. It's ennobling, I think, for everybody else to see the work that you've done. John, we have about a minute. You have something to wrap us up, and then make sure we get the contact information.
Yeah, I just say on travel, I would encourage people to go to Cuba by whatever means.
Right.
And don't just go to Havana or to the beaches. Do that by all means, but go out into the countryside where you'll meet find a more authentic Cuba. But I would particularly encourage people to come on our caravan to Cuba this July. The contact website for us, it's www.ifconews.org, or else you could also type in Pastors for Peace and you'll get to the same website.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Nancy?
I would invite people to join in the caravan this summer. I think it'll be an exciting time, and there'll be a different feeling about it, I think, because we will feel that the crack has been opened up in the wall, and maybe we're actually going to move through it now to something very good.
Is that traditionally the way that it's generational? You have a lot of people, young people, older folks?
It tends to be young and old, a bit of a gap in the middle, because those are the people who have got full-time jobs and families and can't afford the time.
Yeah.
Right.
But there's no restriction on age. Yeah.
Well, we will certainly and eagerly await developments now that the President has taken the lead on at least diplomatic relations with Cuba. Hopefully normalization is coming down the path, would be wonderful. But thank you again both for your great work in this area. You've certainly been not only friends to the United States, but also friends to Cuba, and I think those things are not mutually exclusive. So thank you again so much for being here. Nancy Abbey, a wonderful work with the PDC. John, wonderful work, and wonderful to meet you, by the way, and hopefully we'll see much of you again. Thanks for watching this issue of Voice from the Village. On behalf of Charlie Phillips and Betsy Phillips, our producers, the great folks in the booth, and all the camera work, we thank you for tuning in. I've been Steve Plage, and we'll look for you next time on Voices from the Village. Good night.